The battered old truck leaned at an angle near the edge of the supply lot, its back wheels sinking into gravel that recent rain had turned soft and loose. Bundles of steel, heavy and unwieldy, began to shift toward the lowered tailgate, and for a second it seemed the entire load might tumble loose in a burst of noise and dust. A handful of onlookers lingered by the warehouse entrance, watching but not moving, because lending a hand would cost them time, and time had become a rare commodity in that town. Only one person stepped away from the group. He didn't announce his presence or ask what was needed. He simply pushed up his sleeves and walked into the gusting wind. Gavin Mercer was 41, known around town mainly as the reserved mechanic who ran a modest shop near the edge of Main Street, the sort of man who repaired what was broken and said little about anything beyond the machine in front of him. He had lost his wife years before, though it wasn't something anyone brought up anymore, and he'd grown used to living with that loss quietly, the way other men carried their toolboxes, without fuss, without needing to explain it. He wasn't rich, and he wasn't struggling either. He lived in that comfortable middle ground where a person could go about their life without drawing much notice, and that arrangement suited him just fine, since he'd never cared for being noticed. If people paid attention to anything about Gavin, it was that he pitched in. He'd get the widow's car running on frosty mornings and never bring it up afterward. He'd fix worn brakes for kids who couldn't cover the full price, charging next to nothing, sometimes nothing at all. He never discussed his life before the garage, and if someone asked, he'd smile and steer the talk elsewhere, the way people do when a chapter has been closed for good, and he'd made peace with keeping it that way. His home sat 2 blocks behind the shop, small and orderly, kept that way because order was one of the few things still fully within his control. The only photos on his walls belonged to his late wife, Ellen, gone 9 years now, and even those were sparse, tucked into a hallway rather than displayed for guests, something that occasionally stirred quiet pity from neighbors who assumed he was lonely, when in truth he felt only a settled calm. He spent his evenings on small pursuits, fixing up vintage radios, tending a modest backyard garden, working through used paperbacks from a bookstore 2 towns away. It wasn't a flashy existence. It wasn't the life anyone would have guessed for a man who'd once briefed engineers in boardrooms about structural tolerances. But it was a life he had chosen entirely for himself, and that mattered to him more than anything the life might be missing. That afternoon, Gavin had gone to the supply yard for parts he needed on a truck he was repairing, a plain, unremarkable errand. He was the first to notice the elderly man that everyone else seemed to overlook. Walter Ashcraft stood by his weathered pickup, sleeves pushed up, straining to lift steel bundles clearly too heavy for someone of 72. Sweat had beaded on his forehead despite the cold, and his hands shook faintly with every effort, yet he pressed on, willing to ask the bystanders for assistance or even glance their way. A few people snickered quietly. Someone muttered that the old man should have brought help if he needed it, that it wasn't their concern. Gavin didn't laugh along, didn't say a word. He simply crossed the lot, took his place across from Walter, and without any exchange began hoisting bundles too, matching the older man's rhythm so neither had to labor alone. For nearly an hour the two worked without speaking, the quiet broken only by grunts of effort and steel scraping against the truck bed. As the afternoon stretched on, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp pavement and autumn's first real chill. Still, Gavin kept working, never checking the time, never entertaining the thought of leaving before the job was done. When the final bundle was secured and the tailgate shut, Walter straightened up with a wince and studied the younger man for a long beat, as if trying to work out a riddle he hadn't expected that day. He reached for his wallet, offering payment, the sort of reflexive gesture most men in his position would consider routine, a deal closed. Gavin waved it off and started back toward his own truck when Walter pushed the point, arguing that an hour of hard labor in the cold deserved compensation. Gavin only shrugged and said that if he ever reached old age himself, he hoped someone would do the same for him without expecting anything back. He didn't mean it as some grand statement. It was simply the truth, spoken the plain way a man speaks when he's never learned to dress things up. Walter went quiet for a moment. His eyes, pale but keen despite his years, studied Gavin with an intensity that felt out of proportion to a simple parking lot exchange. There was something calculating in that look, though not unkindly, more like a man running numbers he hadn't planned on running that day, sizing up a stranger's character in a single sentence. Before Gavin could climb into his truck, Walter called out, asking if there was some other way to show his thanks, something beyond money that might settle a debt he clearly felt he owed. Gavin just laughed, waved him off, and said it wasn't necessary, that helping a neighbor wasn't a debt at all, just something a person did, since the alternative was standing idle while somebody struggled. He got in his truck and drove off, and if he thought of the old man that night again, it was only in passing, the way one recalls an ordinary act of kindness on an unremarkable day, already sliding into the pile of small good deeds nobody bothers to tally. He had no idea that Walter Ashcraft had spent close to 40 years building one of the region's largest agricultural manufacturing firms before easing out of daily operations, that the plain pickup and worn flannel weren't the disguise of a poor man, but the deliberate look of someone tired of being valued only for what he owned. He had no idea that the old man sat in his own kitchen that night, replaying the afternoon again and again, dwelling not on the steel he had hauled, but on the plain, unassuming decency of a stranger who had wanted nothing in return. The next morning started like any other for Gavin, the scent of motor oil and coffee filling his small shop as he geared up for another routine day of repairs. He was midway through an oil change on a neighbor's sedan when a long black car turned onto the street, rolling slowly and catching everyone's eye. It was the kind of vehicle never seen on that side of town, sleek, polished, entirely out of place among the worn houses and cracked sidewalks. Within moments, neighbors had gathered on their porches to watch it come to a stop right in front of Gavin's shop. A driver in a dark suit stepped out first, circling around to open the back door with practiced ease. Gavin wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside, puzzled, half expecting the car had simply taken a wrong turn. The driver approached with quiet formality and delivered a line that seemed to freeze the whole street. A man named Walter Ashcraft wished to introduce Gavin to his daughter. Whispers rippled down the block almost instantly, neighbors leaning in toward each other, someone already reaching for their phone to spread the word before Gavin had even processed what he'd heard. He stood there, rag still in hand, trying to square the sweating,
plainly dressed old man from the supply yard with whatever prestigious name apparently belonged to him. It hardly seemed real. Still, the driver waited patiently, as though this kind of surreal interruption were routine in his line of work. Walter himself stepped out of the car a moment later, dressed no differently than the day before, still in the same worn jacket, still moving with the unhurried ease of someone who'd never needed fine clothes to feel important. He greeted Gavin warmly, almost sheepishly, admitting he probably should have introduced himself properly the day before, instead of letting a stranger haul steel for an hour without knowing who he was helping. Gavin, still stunned, could only ask what was going on, and Walter answered with a simple dinner invitation, insisting it was the least he could do after yesterday's kindness. Gavin hesitated. Invitations like this weren't something he was used to, and something in him instinctively pulled back from the attention, the sudden visibility that came with black cars and driver escorts. But there was genuine warmth in Walter's request, an honesty that matched the plain decency Gavin had already sensed in him, and eventually he agreed, if only out of curiosity and the quiet sense that refusing might come across worse than accepting. That evening, dressed in the one collared shirt he owned that didn't carry the faint smell of engine grease, Gavin drove past the edge of town toward a property he'd passed 100 times without ever knowing what sat beyond the long gravel drive. The house that came into view wasn't a mansion in any showy sense, but its size still caught him off guard. A sprawling structure of stone and timber set against rolling fields stretching toward distant mountains, the whole scene lit in the amber glow of a Montana sunset. Inside, he met Clare Ashcraft for the first time, Walter's daughter and the current head of Ashcraft Industrial Supply, the company built from decades of her father's steady, quiet work. She was 37, composed in the way of someone who'd learned early to keep her feelings tucked away during business hours, her handshake firm, her smile polite but guarded. She'd already heard her father's account of the parking lot, and while she appreciated the gesture, part of her assumed this dinner was just another expression of gratitude, hospitality dressed up as a transaction, nothing more. Clare had grown tired over the years of men who approached her with practiced charm and vague ambitions, men whose interest always eventually traced back to the size of her father's company rather than anything real about her. She'd built up walls without quite meaning to, walls made of skepticism and exhaustion, and had long stopped expecting an evening like this to be anything but another performance to endure before retreating to the safety of her office. Dinner started formally enough, the three of them seated at a long table under warm light, conversation drifting between pleasant, forgettable topics. But partway through, Walter excused himself with a thin excuse about checking something in his study, leaving Gavin and Clare alone in a silence neither quite knew how to fill at first. Both understood exactly what he was doing, and both understood there was little point resisting. Clare, more out of habit than real curiosity, began questioning Gavin the way she might screen a job applicant, probing for cracks in whatever story he might be presenting. She asked about his work, his background, why a man with the discipline to run an honest shop never seemed to want more than that. Gavin answered plainly, without dressing it up, without the rehearsed modesty of someone performing humility for an audience. He talked simply about engines and small repairs, about the satisfaction of fixing something broken and handing it back whole. And he never once brought up the encounter at the supply yard, never used it to fish for admiration or sympathy. Something in Clare's posture began to loosen as the conversation went on, her guarded stiffness easing without her fully noticing. There was no performance in how Gavin spoke, no calculation behind his answers, nothing that fit the pattern she'd grown so used to spotting and dismissing. At one point, almost as a test, she asked what he'd do if he suddenly came into a large sum of money, half expecting him to describe some fantasy of expansion or luxury, the way most men did when given the opening. Instead, he thought it over seriously and said he'd probably fix the church roof 2 blocks from his shop, since it had been leaking for 3 winters and nobody in the congregation could afford to repair it. Clare laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, unguarded, and looked almost embarrassed afterward, as though she'd forgotten she still had that in her. By dessert, she found herself asking questions not to test him anymore, but simply because she wanted to know the answers, and that realization unsettled her more than anything he'd actually said. She asked carefully about his late wife, expecting him to deflect the way he'd deflected every other question about his past. He didn't. He spoke of Ellen plainly, without drama, describing the way she used to hum while cooking and how the house had never sounded quite the same since. There was no self-pity in it, only the quiet honesty of a man who'd made peace with grief without pretending it had vanished. Clare found herself moved by that honesty in a way she hadn't expected to be moved by anything that night. When Walter finally returned to the table, feigning surprise at how much time had passed, he caught the faint, easy warmth that had settled between his daughter and their guest, and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile he made no effort to hide. Later, after Gavin had said his goodbyes and the black car carried him back toward town, Walter turned to Clare with something like wonder in his voice, remarking that it had been a long time since he'd seen her talk with anyone, stranger or otherwise, for that long without once checking her phone or steering things back toward business. Clare didn't have a ready answer. She only shrugged, blamed the wine for making her talkative, and retreated to her room with far more questions circling in her head than she cared to admit.
Not everyone shared that view.
Victor Langley, the company's chief operating officer, had spent years quietly steering Clare toward a marriage he believed would consolidate the firm's future in ways that suited his own ambitions, and he watched the growing closeness between Clare and the mechanic with rising suspicion. Victor had built his entire career on careful alliances and long-term positioning, and the sudden arrival of an outsider, warmly welcomed by both Walter and Clare, threatened the delicate structure he'd spent years assembling. He couldn't accept that anyone behaved with such consistent generosity without some hidden angle. Kindness with no strings attached simply didn't exist in Victor's world, not around people with money like the Ashcrafts. Convinced Gavin was running a longer, subtler game than anyone else could see, Victor quietly hired an investigator to dig into Gavin's history, certain that beneath the plain flannel shirts and grease-stained hands, he'd eventually uncover the calculation he was sure must be hiding there. He told a colleague privately, with the flat certainty of a man who trusted his own cynicism over his own eyes, that nobody was ever that decent without wanting something back. What the investigator turned up wasn't the scandal Victor had hoped for. Buried in old records from a firm 2 states away was a different picture of Gavin Mercer entirely, a man who had once served as lead engineer at a mid-sized manufacturing company, respected enough that larger firms had tried to poach him with salaries far beyond what he now earned fixing cars in a small Montana garage. He hadn't left the profession because he'd failed. He'd left because a company decision, one that quietly sacrificed safety standards to protect quarterly earnings, had crossed a line he refused to cross himself. Rather than stay and compromise, he simply walked away, trading a larger, compromised life for a smaller, honest one. When this information eventually reached Clare, filtered through a conversation she overheard rather than one Victor meant for her to hear, she found herself stunned, not with suspicion this time, but with admiration. A man capable of that level of success had set it aside simply because staying would have meant becoming someone he didn't want to be. It was a decision she understood on a level deeper than she'd expected, given how often she weighed principle against profit in boardrooms that rarely rewarded the former. She began seeking Gavin out more deliberately after that, no longer waiting for her father to engineer their encounters. One weekend, she drove to his garage under the pretext of needing help with an old car her father had kept in storage for years, a project neither of them had ever gotten around to finishing. Gavin agreed easily, and the two spent the afternoon under the hood together, hands black with grease, laughter slipping out more freely between them than either expected. There was something disarming about working alongside him, about the unhurried patience with which he explained each part and each repair, never once making her feel foolish for not already knowing. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clare felt herself fully relax, free of the careful posture she wore in every boardroom and business dinner, just a woman elbow-deep in an engine, laughing at her own mistakes without embarrassment. Walter, watching from the porch with a mug of coffee, said nothing to interrupt them. He only smiled to himself, the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd spent a lifetime reading people and had rarely felt more certain about anything than what he saw unfolding in front of him. But Victor wasn't finished. Having failed to dig up any real scandal, he decided to manufacture one instead. Through a string of carefully placed conversations with contacts in the local press, he began seeding a narrative that cast Gavin as an opportunist, a man who had worked his way into the Ashcraft family with calculated patience, waiting for the right moment to extract wealth and influence from a sentimental old man. The story spread quickly, the way stories tend to when they confirm what people already suspect about wealthy families and those who orbit them. Within days, local papers were running speculative pieces questioning the mechanic's sudden closeness to one of the region's most prominent families. Strangers who'd never met Gavin began weighing in publicly, each new voice piling another layer of suspicion onto a story that had started as nothing more than one man helping another load steel into a truck.
A columnist for the regional paper wrote an entire piece speculating on how a small-town mechanic could have positioned himself so precisely in the path of a wealthy old man, as though basic decency needed a hidden motive to be believable. Shareholders, always sensitive to anything that might touch the company's image, began pressuring Clare directly, questioning whether her personal choices might expose Ashcraft Industrial Supply to reputational risk. Old acquaintances Gavin hadn't heard from in years resurfaced, some offering cautious support, others clearly fishing for details to pass along to whoever seemed most interested. Even a few long-time customers grew noticeably cooler, exchanging fewer words when they dropped off their cars, a new weariness in their eyes. Gavin bore it quietly, the way he bore most things, though the weight of being watched and judged for the first time in years sat heavier on him than he let on. Walter stayed silent through it all, refusing to dignify the accusations with a public response, trusting that time and truth moved slower than gossip, but arrived the same eventually. Clare found the silence harder to bear than any accusation. She watched the pressure build around her, watched colleagues who'd once respected Gavin now regard him with wary suspicion whenever he appeared, and for the first time since it had all begun, she felt her old defenses threatening to rise again, the familiar urge to protect herself by pulling back. Gavin noticed the shift right away. He watched Clare grow distant, more guarded in how she spoke to him, and rather than fight for a place he sensed he was no longer welcome in, he made a decision that surprised everyone but himself. He stopped visiting the estate. He stopped returning Walter's calls with the same warmth as before. He told himself it was for the best, that a family already under public scrutiny didn't need an outsider fueling a fire that seemed determined to burn regardless of what he did. Clare, arriving at the garage one afternoon to find it locked and unusually quiet, felt something settle in her chest that she recognized uncomfortably as loss. It was the first time in years she'd let herself feel that particular ache over someone, and the unfamiliarity of it left her standing outside the shuttered garage for a long time before she finally turned and drove away. It was Walter who decided enough was enough. He called an emergency meeting of the board of directors, gathering the very shareholders who'd been whispering loudest into a single room. Without preamble, he showed them security footage pulled from a camera at the supply yard, the same camera that had captured, in grainy but unmistakable detail, the entire afternoon from weeks earlier. The footage told the whole story plainly: an old man in worn clothes struggling alone with a heavy load, a crowd of onlookers doing nothing, and one stranger stepping forward without hesitation, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, simply helping because it was the only decent option on the table. Watching it, there was no way to mistake it for calculation.
Ashcraft really was. There had been no company to infiltrate, no fortune to chase, only an old man struggling with steel and a stranger willing to lend his hands. Walter let the footage speak for itself before adding a single observation to the silent room, that a person's true character shows most clearly in the moments when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain from pretending. The room stayed quiet for a long stretch afterward, the weight of the footage settling even over the most skeptical faces present. Victor, seated near the back, felt the color drain from his face as heads around the room began turning almost imperceptibly toward him. One of the older board members, a woman who'd worked alongside Walter since the company's earliest days, spoke up once the footage ended, admitting she'd known Walter long enough to recognize genuine surprise on his face in that moment, and that no man could fake the particular exhaustion of an aging body straining against a weight it could no longer easily handle. Her words seemed to loosen something in the room, and slowly, one voice after another admitted the story they'd believed so readily now felt thin against the plain evidence in front of them. Word of the meeting spread fast through the company, and within days, the narrative that had traveled so easily through gossip began unraveling just as quickly, replaced by something closer to admiration for the mechanic who had wanted nothing all along.
Clare heard the full story secondhand before her father formally told her, and by the time she sought him out that evening, she already understood, with painful clarity, how badly she'd let doubt override everything her own eyes had already shown her about Gavin's character. She drove to the garage the next morning, arriving before sunrise, and found him already at work, sleeves rolled up despite the cold, exactly as he'd been that very first day. She apologized before he could say anything, the words tumbling out faster than she'd intended, an admission that old wounds and old suspicions had shaped how she'd seen him, that too many men had let her down before, until she'd stopped trusting her own judgment about who deserved her trust. Gavin listened without interrupting, and when she finished, offered only a small, understanding smile, telling her that anyone who'd been hurt before tended to flinch at shadows, and that he didn't blame her for a caution that probably protected her more than it had ever cost her. There was no bitterness in his voice, no lingering resentment, only the same steady patience she'd come to recognize as simply who he was. From that morning on, something between them shifted for good. They began spending time together deliberately, no longer needing Walter's gentle nudging to bring them into the same room. They went fishing along the river that cut through town, Gavin teaching her a patience she hadn't realized she lacked. They spent quiet evenings restoring the old car together, piece by piece, until it finally roared back to life under their combined effort. They sat for hours over coffee, talking of nothing and everything, the kind of conversation that only grows between two people who've stopped performing for each other entirely. One evening along the river, as the light dropped low and orange behind the tree line, Clare admitted something she'd never said aloud to anyone, not even her father, that after years of men circling her for reasons that had nothing to do with who she actually was, she'd started to believe no one would ever want her for herself alone, that the company and the name attached to it had quietly become the thing people actually desired. Gavin listened without rushing to comfort her, letting the words settle before he spoke. He told her simply that he'd known her for weeks now, without once caring what her last name meant to anyone else, that the version of her he'd come to know was the one who forgot to check her phone for hours while elbow-deep in an engine, laughing at her own mistakes, and that version was the only one that had ever interested him. Clare didn't answer right away. She only looked out at the water for a long while, something in her chest loosening after years of being wound tight. Their afternoons at the garage became a quiet ritual neither of them spoke about, but both looked forward to. Clare began showing up most Saturdays with coffee for two, settling on an overturned crate near the workbench while Gavin explained whatever engine sat in front of him that day. Though she rarely followed the technical details, she found herself content just listening to the low, steady rhythm of his voice. Sometimes they said very little at all, comfortable in a silence that had taken most other relationships in her life years to reach, if they ever reached it. Autumn deepened around them, the last leaves steadily falling along Main Street, and with each passing week, the affection between them grew more evident to everyone who knew them. Quiet but unmistakable, the kind of thing that didn't need announcing because it was written plainly across both their faces whenever they were together. But the story wasn't finished with its final test. Victor, humiliated but not yet done, had spent the weeks since the board meeting quietly building relationships with outside investors, men eager to see Walter's influence diminished and willing to help Victor engineer a hostile push to strip him of any remaining control over the company's direction. It was a slow, deliberate plan built around leveraging a large infrastructure project already underway, one that, if failed publicly, could plausibly be blamed on Walter's leadership and used to justify reshaping the board entirely. It was Gavin who first noticed the problem. Reviewing technical documents Clare had shown him one evening, more out of casual interest than any formal role at the company, he spotted a structural miscalculation buried deep in the plans for the new manufacturing facility, an error small enough to slip past several rounds of review, but serious enough that left uncorrected, it risked catastrophic failure once construction reached a critical stage. He understood immediately what silence would mean if the flaw surfaced later, after construction had progressed further. It would confirm every accusation Victor had been quietly spreading about instability at the top of the company, and Walter would very likely be pushed out under circumstances far more damaging than gossip alone could produce. Gavin also understood that raising the issue meant stepping fully into a world he'd spent years deliberately avoiding, accepting a level of visibility he'd never wanted for himself. He sat with the documents for nearly an hour before deciding, turning the choice over the way he'd once turned over the decision that ended his engineering career in the first place. He remembered clearly the meeting years earlier where a room full of capable men had agreed to look away from a flaw because fixing it would have cost time and money none of them wanted to spend, and he remembered walking out of that building for the last time, certain he'd never let silence stand in place of courage. He wouldn't make that mistake twice, not even to stay comfortably out of the spotlight where he preferred to live. He chose to speak up. He brought the documents straight to Clare that same night, walking her through the calculation error with the same patient clarity he used explaining engines, refusing to let his own discomfort with attention outweigh what was clearly the right thing to do.
Clare acted immediately, bringing in independent engineers who confirmed the flaw within hours and traced it back to decisions Victor himself had quietly pushed through months earlier to cut costs and speed up the timeline. Victor's role in pressuring the original engineering team to overlook proper safety margins came to light within days, and this time there was no ambiguity left to shield him, no room for spin or careful denial. He was removed from the company entirely before the week was out, his years of careful political maneuvering undone by a mechanic who had only wanted to help. In the aftermath, with the company stabilized and the threat cleared, Walter approached Gavin once more, this time with an offer far larger than the advisory role he'd proposed months before. He suggested Gavin step into an executive leadership position, a role befitting both his skill and the trust he'd earned from nearly everyone who now knew him. Gavin waited carefully, with the same seriousness he'd given the first offer, and once again, gently but firmly, turned it down. He explained that his happiness had never come from titles or boardrooms, that the garage, small as it was, gave him something no executive position ever could: the quiet satisfaction of fixing something with his own hands and handing it back whole to someone who needed it. Clare, listening nearby, found herself unsurprised by the answer this time, though something in her chest tightened at what it might mean for the two of them going forward. She asked him directly, dropping the careful diplomacy she usually reserved for hard conversations, whether he might consider staying close to her for reasons that had nothing to do with the company at all, whether there was a version of the future where he stayed near her simply because he wanted to, not because any title demanded it. Gavin didn't answer right away. He studied her for a long moment, something soft and certain settling behind his eyes, before finally reaching out and taking her hand. He told her he'd never needed a reason beyond her to want to stay, that the company had never been what kept him near, only her. Walter, watching from a respectful distance across the room, allowed himself a wide, unguarded smile, the kind he rarely let himself show in front of others. Content in a way that had little to do with the company he'd built and everything to do with the family now taking shape in front of him. A year passed quickly after that, the seasons cycling through until autumn returned again, painting the same streets in the same gold and amber light that had first brought Gavin and Walter together outside a supply yard neither of them would ever forget. Gavin still ran his garage, still spent his mornings elbow-deep in engines, still turned down any offer that would have pulled him permanently into boardrooms and meetings that never suited him. Clare, far from resenting the choice, had come to cherish it, often finding excuses to visit the garage in the afternoons just to sit nearby while he worked, content simply sharing the same quiet space. Together, the two of them had started something neither had planned, but both found meaningful: a small fund providing free vehicle repairs for elderly residents and retired laborers across the county who could no longer easily afford the upkeep their cars needed. It grew slowly at first, word passing quietly between neighbors the way good things often do, until eventually a handful of other local mechanics had joined in, donating a few hours each to keep the program running. Walter, meanwhile, had finally stepped back from the company entirely, formally handing full control of Ashcraft Industrial Supply to Clare during a quiet ceremony attended only by close family and longtime colleagues. He seemed lighter somehow in retirement, spending his mornings on long, unhurried drives in the same old pickup that had started it all, occasionally still stopping to help strangers he found struggling along the road, unable even now to fully set aside the habits that shaped his character long before wealth ever entered the picture. At a small family gathering that same autumn, the three of them sat together around a table warmed by candlelight and the low murmur of gathered friends. Walter rose slowly and lifted his glass, his eyes moving between his daughter and the man who somehow, without ever meaning to, become the missing piece of their family. He reminded them both, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly underneath it, that it had all started with nothing more than an old man struggling to load a few crates of steel into the back of his truck. He looked at Gavin then, a warm, knowing smile spreading across his face, and told him that what he'd received for that single afternoon of kindness had turned out to be an entire family, one he never could have predicted, and one he'd never stop being grateful for. Clare reached for Gavin's hand beneath the table, her eyes bright with emotion she no longer felt any need to hide, and Gavin answered with the same steady, peaceful smile he'd worn that very first day in the supply yard, a smile that had never once needed an audience to mean something. As the evening wound down, the three of them stepped out together beneath a canopy of trees still holding on to their last gold leaves, walking slowly towards the house where a new chapter of their lives was quietly beginning. It hadn't been wealth that brought them together, nor status, nor any careful calculation on anyone's part. It was one unremarkable act of kindness, offered freely to a stranger who asked for nothing, that had somehow reshaped the lives of everyone it touched, binding together people who might otherwise have stayed strangers forever into something far more lasting than any fortune could have built alone.